Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
The District of Columbia is one of the world's most beautiful capitals, largely because it was conceived as a capital city from the very beginning. Its grandeur was the vision of a Frenchman, Pierre Charles L'Enfant, who was hired in 1791 by George Washington to plan the city that was to be built in the wilderness. Wrote Washington in 1789, "A century hence, if this country keeps united, it will produce a city, though not so large as London, yet of a magnitude inferior to few others in Europe." The centerpiece of L'Enfant's plan was the area that included the Capitol, the Mall, and the President's residence, which he called the Presidential Palace. Extending from these buildings were a series of broad avenues. He made careful use of the terrain, placing key buildings and many small green parks on natural rises. L'Enfant named the avenues for the states, and using the Capitol as an axis, gave letters to the streets north and south, and numbers to those east and west. He divided the entire city into quadrants that are still recognized. Washington has the attributes of a southern town, never attracting the large groups of immigrants that throng to New York, Boston, and Chicago. Washington is a city that moves at a slower pace. Perhaps that is also a factor of the weather, which can range from the pleasantly temperate in winter to sweltering heat and humidity in the summer. Getting around Washington isn't impossible, but it demands careful forethought and preparation. Driving a car can be frustrating. Streets are congested, parking lots are crowded if not full, and some motorists have been trapped for hours trying to navigate in and around the downtown area. The bus system has been politely described as complex. On the other hand, the Washington Metro, the new subway system, is pleasant and efficient, and taxis in the district are usually available and not too expensive. Visitors to the Capitol can take advantage of the special Tourmobile system. A single all-day rate allows rides from one attraction to another, with stops at 15 sites around the mall and 3 at Arlington. Narrators are aboard each Tourmobile to provide commentary and answer questions. At the east end of the National Mall is the U.S. Capitol Building, home to the Congress of the United States. By act of the National Commission of Fine Arts, the building's 180-foot-high dome will dominate the skyline forever. The Commission fixed a maximum rooftop height of 110 feet for buildings in the downtown district, so that the Capitol dome could rise above all others and be seen from all directions. When L'Enfant chose the hill at the west end of Jenkins Avenue for the Capitol building, he declared, "It stands as a pedestal waiting for a monument." The design of the building was chosen in a nationwide competition, and Jefferson wrote that the Capitol plan captivated the eye and judgment of all. Writing in 1843, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "If Washington should ever grow to be a great city, the outlook from the Capitol will be unsurpassed in the world. Now at sunset, I seem to look westward far into the heart of the continent from this commanding position." When the British burned Washington in 1814, the Executive Mansion was not spared from the flames. But a courageous Dolly Madison was able to save a great deal from destruction. Most valuable was the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington that she cut from its frame just minutes before fleeing the great house. When the Executive Mansion was rebuilt in 1817, its charred walls were painted white, and the home has been known ever since as the White House. The building has undergone numerous changes since then, both external and internal. In 1824, the south portico was added, and 5 years later, the north. And the Truman balcony was added in 1948. The Trumans actually lived across the street at Blair House for 4 years, so that the White House could undergo a much-needed renovation. With the building more structurally sound, future presidents and their wives devoted time and money to restoring the house's decor. Thanks largely to the early efforts of Jacqueline Kennedy, the White House is now a showcase for American art and furnishings, and a link between past, present, and future chief executives. L'Enfant's master plan for Washington called not only for powerful buildings and magnificent broad avenues, but also for a network of parks. With an acute eye for detail, L'Enfant insisted that the parks be adorned with statues, columns, or other ornaments to honor the heroes of the nation. And his wish has been granted. Today, more than 300 memorials and statues can be found in almost every open space.
Oyez! Oyez! All persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States, are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the United States and this honorable court.
So begins each session of the United States Supreme Court. Until 1935, the court sat in the Capitol, but then its own building was constructed. A rather formal edifice, which one justice called wholly inappropriate for a quiet group of old boys such as the Supreme Court. In 1981, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor took her seat on the bench, ending the all-male tradition of the great judicial body. The nation's library, the Library of Congress, is one of the world's largest, housing a collection of more than 80 million items in 470 languages. Originally housed in the Capitol, the first library collection was lost when the British burned that building during the War of 1812. As a replacement, Thomas Jefferson offered to sell the government his personal library of more than 6,000 books, which became the foundation of the present collection. Although the library still performs its primary function of providing Congress with the information it needs to make informed judgments, its scope has widened considerably. Its shelves house not only more than 20 million books, but the collection also includes 4 million maps and atlases, violins by Stradivarius, an extensive collection of films, including the first motion picture print by Thomas Edison. One of only 3 existing vellum copies of the Gutenberg Bible, and perhaps its most treasured item, a draft of the Declaration of Independence in Jefferson's own handwriting, complete with notes and corrections by Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. Complementing the collection of the Library of Congress is the National Archives, which houses the key documents of American history. In the rotunda of the exhibition hall are the Declaration of Independence, pages from the Constitution of the United States, and the Bill of Rights. These 3 documents spend each night in a 50-ton vault 20 feet below ground for safekeeping. They're raised each morning for exhibition, but armed guards are on hand to protect them at all times. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing is the only security printing plant in the world open to the public. It's here that every dollar of U.S. currency is printed at the rate of more than 22 million notes a day, or roughly $66 billion a year. Mention the Smithsonian Institution, and most people think automatically of a red brick building that looks like an ancient castle sitting on the Mall in Washington. The famous Castle on the Mall, completed in 1855, was in fact the original Smithsonian building, which today houses administrative offices and an information center. The Smithsonian is one of America's greatest national treasures. It was established in 1846 with funds bequeathed by an English scientist, James Smithson. Interestingly, Smithson never visited the United States, but left his entire estate, $500,000, to this country to found at Washington an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. Now an independent federal agency, the Smithsonian Institution is an important research center dedicated to public education, national service, and scholarship in the arts, sciences, and history. It's been called affectionately the nation's attic because of its collection of more than 100 million artifacts gathered from all corners of the world, from every period in history. The Smithsonian is no longer a single building, but 13 museums, plus the National Zoo, constituting the world's largest museum complex. Washington, wrote James Fenimore Cooper in 1838, has certainly an air of more magnificence than any other American town. It is mean in detail, but the outline has a certain grandeur about it. Besides the Capitol, the Washington Monument is probably the most recognizable structure on the Washington skyline. At 555 feet, it's the world's tallest masonry structure. L'Enfant's original plan put this monument slightly west of where it now stands. He wanted it to lie at precisely the axis where the White House would face the direct east-west line along the Mall at a 90-degree angle. Unfortunately, the Mall was too soggy to support the structure, and it was positioned a little to the east. Though planners first conceived of the monument in 1783, 16 years before Washington's death, work didn't begin until 1848 and wasn't completed until 1884. Construction was slowed by a lack of funds and interrupted by the Civil War and another peculiar occurrence. A block of marble from Rome sent by Pope Pius IX was to have been included in a wall of the monument, but the marble was stolen in 1854. Religious and political disfavor caused contributions to fall to a new low. Until this time, the monument had been supported solely by private contributions, but lack of funds had slowed construction on a number of occasions. This time, work on the monument stopped and wasn't resumed again until the government took over the job in the 1870s. By that time, the marble was taken from a different level of the quarry and was noticeably darker. Even today, it's apparent that the color of the marble in the monument changes past a point about 150 feet up. The second great presidential memorial in Washington is the magnificent Lincoln Memorial. It was from the steps of this monument, and in the spirit of its namesake, that Dr. Martin Luther King spoke to the hearts and hopes of the nation.
I say to you today, my friend, let freedom reign. When we let it reign from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Completed in 1922, the structure is a rectangular Doric temple reminiscent of the Parthenon in Greece. The 36 columns represent the 36 states in the Union at the time of Lincoln's death. Inside, the pensive figure of Lincoln sits surrounded by the words of his most memorable speeches.
87 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Said the poet Walt Whitman, "He was a mountain in grandeur of the soul. He was a sea in deep undervoice of mystic loneliness. He was a star in steadfast purity of purpose and service, and he abides." Those seeking a less traditional view of the Lincoln Memorial can join a tour inside the structure's foundation.
Inside the chamber, the statue altogether weighs 475 tons, and right now we are underneath the statue itself. So these are pretty huge structures right here.
Humid conditions there have encouraged the growth of stalactites and stalagmites, making the space resemble a young cave. Back upstairs, from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, is a majestic view: the reflecting pool, which mirrors the Washington Monument. The third presidential memorial, honoring Thomas Jefferson, was authorized by Congress in 1934 and completed in 1943. The style of the memorial, a classical dome and colonnade, is in the style of the Pantheon in Rome. Inside, a 19-foot bronze statue of Jefferson stands in solemn tribute to the man who dared to conceive a great nation. Choosing the site for the Jefferson Memorial was a difficult task, since it had not been included in L'Enfant's master plan. Ultimately, the memorial was built on land reclaimed from the Potomac River, the portion now known as the Tidal Basin. It was at the Tidal Basin in 1912 that Mrs. William Howard Taft planted the first cherry trees, a gift from Japan. The first efforts to grow the beautiful trees here failed miserably, causing a great deal of embarrassment. The first 2,000 trees were infested with insects and disease and had to be burned. 2 years later, a second shipment arrived in Seattle and was sent by train to Washington. Each spring, the blooming of these trees, which only lasts a week or two, is celebrated in the National Cherry Blossom Festival. Only about 60 of the original trees from Japan are still alive, but the National Park Service has been replacing them with the help of private donations. Whatever we are looking for, wrote historian Bruce Catton in 1959, we come to Washington in millions to stand in silence and try to find it. At Washington's newest memorial, dedicated to the more than 58,000 servicemen and women who died or remain missing in Vietnam, thousands come at all times of the day and night to stand in silence. They search the polished walls for the names of friends and relatives who were lost, for they are all engraved here, etched deep in the rich black granite and in the national memory. When President Kennedy died in 1963, his family requested that any memorial to the slain president be a living memorial. With their request in mind, the planned National Cultural Center in Washington was named the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and dedicated to his memory. Here, an opera house, concert hall, 2 dramatic theaters, and a cinema provide an ongoing menu of cultural events. It's a fitting tribute to the president who called for a new frontier for American art. Compared to its neighbor to the north, New York City, Washington used to be called a hick town that closed early, offering few cultural attractions, if any. But in recent years, the district has changed its image. Besides those at the Kennedy Center, theater goers can find productions to suit any taste. The theater of greatest renown, however, is Ford's Theater, site of President Lincoln's assassination. In 1968, Ford's Theater was restored to its 1865 appearance and reopened. Today's theater goers can still gaze up to the presidential box, decorated as it was on the April night when Lincoln was shot. Wrote one observer in 1874, "Never till the Capitol had cost the life of the beautiful and the brave of our land did it become to the heart of the American citizen of the 19th century the object of personal love that it was to George Washington." Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia is dedicated to the thousands of men and women who gave their lives in the service of their country. To those Americans who remember the grim days of November 1963, the view of the Arlington Memorial Bridge, leading from the Lincoln Memorial to the cemetery, is etched permanently in somber black and white images.
An eternal flame is lighted before the grave by Mrs. Kennedy, the first such memorial to burn in Arlington Cemetery. She is followed by the President's brothers, Robert and Edward.
The grave of President John F. Kennedy is still marked by an eternal flame lit the day of his funeral. Nearby, the grave of his brother, Robert, is marked by a simple cross. Only one other president, William Howard Taft, is buried here. Perhaps the most moving sight in the cemetery is the tomb of the unknown soldier, in which lie the unidentified remains of soldiers from World Wars I and II, the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The tomb is guarded 24 hours a day by a specially selected honor guard from the 3rd United States Infantry. Service at the tomb is voluntary and limited to the select few who can withstand the rigorous training and demands of the detail. It is also the highest honor, reflected in these words of the Sentinel's Creed. "My dedication to this sacred duty is total and wholehearted. In the responsibility bestowed on me, never will I falter. And with dignity and perseverance, my standard will remain perfection. Through the years of diligence and praise and the discomfort of the elements, I will walk my tour in humble reverence to the best of my ability. It is he who commands the respect I protect, his bravery that made us so proud, surrounded by well-meaning crowds by day, alone in the thoughtful peace of night. This soldier will in honored glory rest under my eternal vigilance.
Left, shoulder. Forward. Forward. Forward.
Just up the Potomac, resting peacefully at his beloved estate, Mount Vernon, lies George Washington, soldier, statesman, president, and visionary who predicted the greatness of the city that bears his name. "200 years after its founding, long after its growth exceeded even L'Enfant's great plan, Washington, D.C. remains, in the words of one visitor, an invented city, neither Rome nor home. It's a city that we hold to a higher standard than any other. What you want," wrote an observer in 1913, "is to have a city which everyone who comes from Maine, Texas, Florida, Arkansas, or Oregon can admire as being something finer and more beautiful than he had ever dreamed of before." Washington struggles to fulfill its promise, fortified by the blessing of John Adams. May the spirit which animated the great founder of this city descend to future generations.